In the quiet town of Leeds, England during the winter of 1988, a tragic and brutal case shocked both the local community and the wider public. It was a time when the rights and identities of transgender individuals, especially those within the Muslim community, were rarely acknowledged, let alone protected. The story revolves around Zahra Hassan, a 27-year-old woman of Pakistani descent who had recently undergone a gender transition, in secret, navigating her identity in a society where such a truth was often met with harsh judgment and severe consequences. Zahra was known to her neighbors and close acquaintances as a polite, well-mannered woman who often kept to herself. Her transition had been carried out in secrecy, supported only by a small circle of trusted friends, born as Ahmed Hassan. She had struggled for years with her gender identity, torn between her religious upbringing and her inner reality. After moving to Leeds to escape the scrutiny of her conservative family, back home in Bradford, she began a new life under her chosen name, Zahra. Despite living in an era and culture that viewed her identity as taboo, Zahra longed for a normal life. Like many women, she wished to find love, stability, and acceptance. It was through mutual friends at a small community gathering that she met Khalid Mahmood, a 30-year-old man, originally from Manchester, who had recently moved to Leeds for work. Khalid, described as a quiet but intense man, came from a strict Muslim background, and his family remained unaware of Zahra's history when the two began courting. Their courtship was brief, lasting only a few months before Khalid proposed marriage. According to friends, Zahra hesitated at first, but eventually agreed, perhaps seeing in Khalid a chance at the normal life she had always dreamed of. It is unclear whether Zahra ever revealed her past to Khalid. Some friends claimed she had confided in him and believed he had accepted her fully. Others doubted this, suggesting she had kept her secret out of fear of losing him. Their wedding took place in early December 1988, a modest ceremony attended by only a few people from Farouk's side. Zahra appeared, radiant, hopeful that her struggles might finally be behind her. Yet beneath the surface, tensions were brewing. Farouk's family, suspicious of Zahra's background, had started to ask questions. Moreover, rumors had been circulating in the small community about Zahra's past identity. Whispers that might have reached Khalid before or shortly after the wedding. The marriage, which should have been the start of a new chapter, instead became the beginning of a nightmare. Only one day after the wedding, Zahra would be found dead in her apartment, a case that would soon unravel into a story of violence, betrayal, and fatal intolerance. This case not only exposed the hidden struggles faced by transgender individuals within marginalized communities, but also highlighted broader issues of gender identity, domestic violence, and cultural conflict. At a time when transgender rights were virtually non-existent, Zahra's death served as a tragic reminder of how society's prejudice could have lethal consequences. As details of the case later emerged, they would shock authorities and ignite debates about identity acceptance and justice in an era largely unwilling to confront such issues. Now, decades later, Zahra's story stands as one of the most chilling examples of hidden lives and fatal secrets, a story that continues to resonate in ongoing conversations about the intersection of gender, faith, and violence. It was a cold and foggy morning on December 14, 1988, when neighbors of Zahra and Khalid first sensed that something was terribly wrong. The couple had been married for only one day, and yet disturbing noises had echoed through their small apartment late into the previous night. One neighbor, Mrs. Elaine Turner, an elderly woman living directly below, reported hearing shouts, crashes, and what she described as angry, violent yelling around midnight. though she had knocked on the door once. No one answered, and fearing a private domestic matter, she retreated to her flat when morning came. The usually quiet apartment remained oddly still. Zara, who was known to visit the local grocer every morning, did not appear, nor did Pharaoh show any sign of leaving the flat by 10 a.m. Mrs. Turner, concerned by the silence following the night's chaos, decided to check on them again. She knocked several times, but still there was no response. She later recalled to police that an unsettling sense of dread had filled her as she waited by the door, hoping to hear footsteps or a voice. It wasn't until 3 p.m., when the landlord arrived to collect monthly rent, that the door was finally opened. But what he found inside would spark a full-scale police investigation. Zara's body was discovered in the small living room, lying motionless on the carpet, her face battered beyond recognition. Bloodstains marked the floor and parts of the wall, as if a violent struggle had occurred. The landlord, visibly shaken, called emergency services immediately. Interestingly, Khalid Mahmoud was nowhere to be found. His belongings, including his suitcase and wallet, were still in the apartment, but the man himself had vanished. Without a trace to neighbors and authorities alike, it seemed impossible to understand how a wedding celebrated just the day before could end in such horrific tragedy. As the police arrived and cordoned off the apartment, word of the incident quickly spread through the community. Whispers filled the air, some speculating that Zara's secret had been discovered, while others wondered if something even darker had transpired behind closed doors. The initial mystery only deepened when authorities began interviewing neighbors, trying to reconstruct the hours leading up to Zara's death. The timeline was blurry. Witnesses mentioned seeing Khalid and Zara return to the apartment after their small wedding celebration around 7:00 p.m. The two were reportedly seen entering their flat, Zara smiling, holding a small bouquet. But after that moment, no one saw either of them again until the landlord's grim discovery. What puzzled investigators most was the absence of any forced entry or robbery. Nothing seemed stolen or out of place, aside from the clear signs of a brutal assault. It was as if the violence had erupted suddenly from within the relationship itself. But what could have driven Khalid, if he was indeed the culprit, to such a violent act, mere hours after marrying Zara? As police gathered evidence, including torn pieces of Zara's wedding dress and broken household items, they knew they were dealing with a crime that was deeply personal. But without Khalid in custody, answers remained elusive, and as detectives dug deeper, they began to uncover details that would soon shock everyone involved. Truths about Zara's identity, her hidden past, and the lies that may have led to her death. The mystery had only just begun, and behind it lay a tangled web of secret shame and deadly consequences that would take weeks to fully unravel. As the investigation unfolded, forensic reports painted a grim picture of Zara's final hours. The evidence suggested that sometime between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m., a violent altercation had erupted inside the small apartment. Blood spatter analysis indicated that the attack had taken place in the living room near the sofa, and that Zara had fought back before succumbing to the fatal assault. Authorities suspected that the confrontation had started with a revelation, one that changed everything. Whether through rumor and overheard conversation or some last-minute confession, Khalid Mahmoud had likely discovered Zara's gender history, given his strict upbringing and traditional beliefs. The revelation would have been shocking and humiliating to him. The police speculated that upon learning the truth, Khalid's emotions had spiraled into uncontrollable rage. The evidence suggested a prolonged, brutal beating. Zara had suffered multiple fractures to her face and skull, indicating she had been repeatedly struck with great force. The crime scene pointed to bare fists, possibly combined with blunt objects, from within the apartment. Bruising along her arms and shoulders showed she had attempted to defend herself, but Khalid had overpowered her completely. Forensic reports later confirmed that the final fatal blow came from a heavy glass ashtray found shattered near Zahra's body. The impact had caused a fatal cranial injury, likely rendering her unconscious, before she bled out on the carpet. Police found strands of hair and blood on the object, confirming it had been used as a weapon. But what happened next only deepened the horror, rather than calling for help or attempting to flee immediately. Farooq had stayed in the apartment for several more hours. Investigators discovered a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the kitchen table, something highly unusual for a practicing Muslim. The scene suggested that after killing, Zahra Khalid had sat in the dark, drinking in silence, possibly grappling with what he had done sometime between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. He wiped the blood from his hands, took his coat, and vanished. He left behind his personal belongings, including his wallet and identification, which suggested he had left in a hurry. The apartment door was locked from the inside, meaning he had likely used the window in the back alley to escape. By the time police arrived later that afternoon, Khalid was already long gone. The brutality of the crime sent shockwaves through the local Muslim community. While many refused to speak about Zahra's identity, others whispered that Farooq had been deceived and that his rage was understandable. However, as detectives pieced together the evidence, it became clear that this was not a crime of passion alone. It was a cold, merciless execution with a suspect on the run and a community divided. Investigators knew that finding Khalid was only the beginning. The true depth of this case and the hidden struggles that led to it were yet to be fully uncovered. The investigation into Zahra death officially began within hours of the discovery of her body. Leading the case was Detective Inspector Richard Calloway, a seasoned officer with over a decade of experience in homicide investigations. From the outset, Calloway and his team recognized that this was no ordinary murder. The violent nature of the crime and the layers of secrecy surrounding Zahra's life made the investigation particularly sensitive and complex. The first step for the detectives was to reconstruct the last 24 hours of Zahra's life. Starting from the moment she and Khalid were last seen together, they interviewed neighbors, including Mrs. Turner, who gave a chilling account of the loud and violent argument she overheard on the wedding night. Other neighbors recalled hearing glass shattering and furniture being knocked over, painting a picture of a home descending into chaos. Investigators then turned their attention to Zahra's close friends, including two women, Lila and Enzen, who had supported her during her gender transition. Both women were devastated by the news of Zahra's death and provided crucial insights into her life through them. Detectives learned about Zahra's secret past as Ahmed Hassan, her struggles with acceptance, and her deep fear of being discovered, especially within a conservative community. What shocked investigators most was the revelation that Zahra may never have told Khalid the truth about her past. According to Lila, Zahra had confided her fear that Khalid would react violently if he knew Lila also disclosed that Zahra had been receiving anonymous threats in the weeks leading up to her wedding. Handwritten notes slipped under her door, warning her against marrying Khalid. These notes were turned over to the police for forensic analysis. Detectives began to trace Farooq's background, reaching out to his family and friends in Manchester. However, his family denied knowing anything about his whereabouts, and when questioned, seemed hostile and defensive, refusing to believe that Khalid could be involved in such a brutal crime. Some family members even insisted that Zara had deceived Khalid, framing him as a victim rather than a perpetrator. Meanwhile, forensic teams Con Ed through the apartment for every clue they collected: fingerprints, blood samples, and broken items from the crime scene. The analysis confirmed that only Zara's and Farouk's fingerprints were present in the apartment, ruling out the involvement of a third-party police. Also recovered the torn pieces of Zara's wedding dress, some of which had traces of blood, suggesting that her death had occurred shortly after an intense struggle. Investigators also found Farouk's passport and travel documents, indicating that he had not planned the murder in advance, but likely acted out of sudden rage. Yet his disappearance complicated the case, with no credit card transactions, no witnesses seeing him leave, and no confirmed sightings. Khalid had seemingly vanished into thin air. To widen their search, authorities issued an all-points bulletin, a PB, and contacted border agencies, fearing that Khalid might attempt to flee the country. His photograph was circulated to train stations, airports, and seaports across the UK. Police also alerted Interpol in case he sought refuge abroad, as days turned into weeks. The pressure mounted on police to locate Khalid and deliver justice for Zara. Media outlets began covering the story, though many sensationalized Zara's identity, focusing less on the violence she suffered and more on her past as a transgender woman. This stirred public debate, with some calling for justice, while others, influenced by prejudice, blamed Aira for provoking Farouk's rage. Despite public division, Detective Calloway remained focused on the facts. He publicly vowed that no matter where Khalid ran, he would be found and held accountable behind the scenes. Detectives continued to follow every lead, interviewing Farouk's acquaintances, monitoring his family, and checking transport hubs daily. Yet, the deeper the police dug, the more they uncovered layers of secrets that would soon redefine the case, entirely revealing that Zara's murder was not just about one man's rage, but about a society's deep-rooted intolerance and fear. As weeks passed and the hunt for Khalid Mahmoud intensified, detectives began to uncover a series of shocking revelations that would shift the course of the investigation. What initially appeared to be a domestic violence case soon revealed itself as a web of betrayal, deception, and societal prejudice, more complex than anyone had imagined. The breakthrough came when Detective Inspector Calloway revisited the anonymous threat letters that Zara had received before her wedding. The forensic team identified two different handwriting styles, indicating that more than one person had been involved in intimidating Zara. This discovery suggested a broader conspiracy, not just an isolated act of violence. Further analysis revealed fingerprints on one of the letters. To everyone's surprise, one of the prin did not belong to either Zara or Khalid. After running it through the national database, it was matched to Khed Mahmoud Farouk's younger brother, a man with a known record of minor assaults and intimidation, mostly linked to enforcing family honor in their community. Detectives now suspected that Khalid may not have acted alone, and that his family had possibly orchestrated or encouraged the violence. This theory gained strength when Calloway's team interviewed a distant cousin of Khalid, who, after hours of questioning, finally admitted that Khed and Khalid had argued bitterly over Zara in the weeks before the wedding. According to this relative, Khed had warned Khalid not to marry Zara, claiming he had heard rumors about her past. The turning point came when a friend of Khed, under pressure from police, confessed that he had overheard Khed discussing Zara's deception and boasting that they would make her pay if Khalid went ahead with the marriage. This confession, though indirect, suggested the family had known about Zara's transgender identity before Khalid ever married her, and there may have been a collective plan to confront or harm her. Another shocking detail emerged when police dug deeper into Farouk's own background. Although he presented himself as a devout man, investigators discovered that Khalid had a history of violence against women, including a previously unreported assault on a former fiancé who had chosen not to press charges out of fear of family retaliation. This painted Khalid not as a man driven into a single moment of rage, but as someone with a violent temper and a pattern of controlling behavior. Adding to the complexity, detectives interviewed Imam Yusuf, a respected religious leader from the local mosque. The imam reluctantly admitted that Khalid had approached him privately weeks before the wedding, expressing doubts about Zara. Though the imam claimed he advised Khalid to approach the matter calmly and seek understanding, he now believed Khalid had been secretly investigating Zara, possibly with his brother Ked's help. What shocked the community even more was the possibility that Khalid married Zara with the full intention of confronting her. Or worse, it was no longer clear whether the murder was truly a crime of passion or a calculated act disguised as a sudden outburst of anger. Meanwhile, public opinion began to shift as these details came to light. Zara's friends, previously silenced by fear and shame, started to speak out in her defense. Nazrin, one of her closest confidants, bravely addressed the media saying, "Aim didn't deserve this. She was a kind soul trying to live her truth. She feared this very thing, that one day someone would find out and hurt her, and that fear came true." This public testimony humanized Zara in the eyes of many, challenging the narrative that she was to blame for her death. Feminist and LGBTQ+ rights groups, who had previously stayed silent out of respect for the family, now organized protests and vigils in Zara's memory, demanding justice with mounting evidence pointing to a possible family conspiracy. And with Khalid still missing, authorities realized the case was much bigger than they had anticipated. What started as a domestic violence case had now become a high-profile investigation into an honor-based killing fueled by prejudice and societal shame. Detective Calloway, now fully aware of the deeper motives, renewed public calls for Farouk's capture, warning that anyone found aiding his escape would face prosecution as the truth of Zara's life and death emerged. So did a deeper, unsettling reality that in a world where being true to oneself can be deadly, justice for Amira meant more than catching a killer. It meant exposing and challenging a system that allowed her murder to happen. Despite weeks of searching, Khalid Mahmoud remained elusive. The police had placed his name on an Interpol red notice, meaning that if he attempted to leave the country or cross any border, he would be arrested immediately. Yet there were no flight records, no credit card transactions, and no known associates aiding his escape. It was as if he had vanished. Detective Richard Calloway and his team suspected he was being hidden by family or sympathetic members of his community, possibly under the guise of seeking religious protection. Given the emerging evidence that his brother Ked was involved, authorities began to intensify surveillance on Farouk's relatives, watching their movements and intercepting communications. The breakthrough came 40 days after Zara's murder. Acting on an anonymous tip, authorities raided a small house in Bradford, an area with a close-knit conservative community. Neighbors had reported seeing a man matching Khalid's description, entering the property late at night and never leaving during the day at 3:45 a.m. Under the cover of darkness, a special tactical team moved in. Armed officers surrounded the house, while detectives knocked on the door, and the elderly woman, later identified as Farouk's distant aunt, answered, visibly nervous, when asked if Khalid was inside. She denied it, but her trembling hands and darting eyes told another story. The officers moved quickly. They swept through the house room by room until they reached a locked door at the back of the house. After forcing it open, they found Faroo crouched in a corner, looking disheveled and exhausted, his beard unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes bloodshot. Khalid did not resist. He lifted his hands in silent surrender, perhaps realizing that his time had run out. The arrest was swift. Officers cuffed him and escorted him out of the house, while a small crowd of neighbors watched from their windows as he was led into the police vehicle. He kept his head down, refusing to meet the cameras flashing in the dark at the station. During initial questioning, Khalid remained silent, refusing to answer any questions about the night Zara was killed. However, when confronted with the forensic evidence, the witness testimonies, and his brother Khalid's suspected involvement, his demeanor shifted, his hands trembled, his breath became uneven, and for the first time, the weight of what he had done seemed to settle upon him. Khalid finally spoke. "She lied to me." He muttered, his voice shaking, not with remorse but with anger. "I was tricked. Do you know what it's like to be humiliated?" Like that, Detective Calloway leaned forward. "So you killed her." Faroo did not respond immediately. Then, after a long pause, he simply said, "I did what any man would do." That was all the detectives need, as news of his arrest spread. The public reaction was divided. Some, particularly those from conservative backgrounds, viewed Khalid as a man pushed to the edge. Others, including women's rights activists and LGBTQ+ groups, saw it for what it was: a brutal, calculated murder, fueled by toxic masculinity and societal oppression, with Khalid in custody and his brother Kid now a prime suspect for conspiracy. The case moved to trial preparations, but justice for Zara was far from over. The trial would become a landmark case that would not only determine Pharaoh's fate, but also expose deeper systemic issues of prejudice, honor-based violence, and the struggle for identity. The world was watching, and the next battle would be fought inside the courtroom. The trial of Khalid Mahmoud for the murder of Zara began 3 months after his arrest. The courtroom was filled with journalists, activists, and members of the public, all eager to witness what was already being called one of the most controversial cases of the decade. From the opening statements, the prosecution made their case clear. They argued that Zara's murder was a premeditated act, fueled by Farouk's rage upon discovering her transgender identity, but also pressured by family honor and societal prejudice. The prosecutor, Eleanor Davies, emphasized Zara's right to live and love freely and condemned the brutality of her death, describing in detail the extent of her injuries and the fear she must have felt in her final moments. In contrast, Farouk's defense team attempted to paint him as a victim, a man who had been deceived by Zara and acted in a moment of uncontrollable rage. When he learned the truth, they argued that his cultural background and strict family values had pushed him to the edge. But as the trial progressed, this narrative quickly unraveled. Witness after witness testified against Khalid. Zara's close friends, including Nazrin and Lila, gave heartbreaking accounts of how Zara lived in constant fear and had confided in them about receiving threats from Khalid's circle. The neighbor, Mrs. Turner, recounted the violent arguments and screams she heard on the night of the murder, confirming that Zara's death was no accident. The most damaging testimony came from forensic experts who presented detailed analysis of the crime scene. Zara's torn dress, the blood evidence, and the threatening letters, which bore Khed Ibrahim's fingerprints, though Khed himself refused to testify and remained under investigation. His connection to the case highlighted the potential involvement of family conspiracy. When Khalid took the stand, his demeanor was cold and his words void of remorse. He admitted to striking Zara, claiming he was blinded by betrayal. But under cross-examination, his anger surfaced, and he confessed to having planned to confront her, if the rumors of her past were true. After 3 weeks of intense proceedings, the jury deliberated for 3 days. On the 3rd day, they returned with a unanimous verdict, guilty of murder. The judge, in delivering the sentence, did not hold back in a powerful statement. He said Zara Hassan was a woman who sought love and acceptance in a world that showed her neither your actions, Mr. Mahmoud, were not those of a man betrayed, but of a man consumed by hatred and pride. You took a life for no reason other than prejudice and anger. This court condemns your crime. Thanks for watching True Crime Cases.